Hello students, welcome in this class. Today we are going to study chapter Motion and Time part 5 for class 7. Students, during previous classes we have studied about motion and rest, the basic concept of rest and motion along with speed of motion. Today we will study the graphical representation of motion. We will study about graphs of different types of motion or different types of graphs representing motion. Let us see. First of all, in short, we will see what is graph. Graph can be defined as a diagram showing the relationships between two or more things or quantities, you can say. So students, graph shows the simply relationship between two or more quantities or two or more things, you can say. Now students, here you can see the different types of graphs like pie chart, line graph, scatter plot graph, bar chart or bar graph, column chart, area chart. There are different types of graphs. Some of you have familiar with, but some are new for you. Basically, for study of motion and time, we will discuss in the form of line graph. Just see how can we define a distance time graph. A graph which represents the distance traveled by an object with respect to time is called a distance time graph. Students, this was the definition for distance time graph. Let us see a simple distance time graph. You can see this axis is called x-axis and this vertical axis is called y-axis. Generally, we represent time on x-axis and distance on y-axis, and we take suitable graph according to the situation. Let us see here. Let us assume that time is represented in second. We can take any unit according to the situation of motion, and here we consider the distance in meter. So students, as you can see, in 5 seconds, between 0 to 5 seconds, objects travels a distance of 10 meters, and up to 10 seconds it reaches to 20 meters. In 15 seconds the object reaches at 30 meters, and in 20 seconds the object reaches at 40 meters, and so on. So this motion representing graph shows the relation between time and distance traveled by the object in different time periods. Let us proceed further. Here students, you have to understand that the slope of a distance time graph indicates the speed of object. The slope of distance time graph, students, shows the speed of object. If the distance time graph has a low slope, then the object has lower speed, and if distance time graph has a higher slope, then the object has a higher speed. Here the slope means how fast or how soon the graph reaches its height, or how the graph goes higher and higher in a lesser time. Students, as we see the previous graph, here we can see as graph moves from left to right, the left to right expansion of graph is representing for time, is representation of time, and as graph go higher it represents the distance traveled. So left to right time spent, and bottom to top it shows distance traveled. So as the graph goes higher in lesser time, as the graph reaches its height in a lesser time, its speed will consider more or a higher speed. So we have discussed. Now just see the graph representing time and corresponding distance. Here students, if you observe the graph carefully, this is the slope for graph A and this is the slope for graph B. Students, slope of graph B is clearly less than slope of graph A. So speed of object A is greater than the speed of object B. Now you understood, students, you should understand that how slope of graph represents the speed of motion. Let us see the distance time graph for uniform speed or constant speed. As a student's slope of graph represents its speed, so if slope of graph does not change, slope of graph remains constant in case of a straight line, so it represents constant speed or uniform speed, so the graph shows uniform motion. Now see the distance time graph for object at rest. Since the graph does not changes its height, only it represents the time spending. The graph represents only the time spending. There is no change in distance, no covering distance. The object is at rest at a constant position, so this graph shows rest. That is zero slope. A graph which is parallel to time axis shows zero slope, that is zero speed, or you can say object is at rest. Now see next graph. In this graph you can see clearly the slope of graph increases with time. The slope of graph increases with time. Here the slope of graph is less than, as we go with time the slope increases. In this case we can say this represents non-uniform motion. This graph represents non-uniform motion. For non-uniform motion, distance time graph is a curved line. Any curved line, any type of curved line will represent non-uniform motion. See this non-uniform motion with increasing speed. As slope increases, the speed also increases, and this represents decreasing speed, as here the slope is you can see the highest slope, and as we go higher the slope decreases, hence it shows decreasing speed. So students, we have seen the two types of graph under non-uniform motion. It may be different types of curves to representing a non-uniform motion. Now see, let us recall the straight line graph shows uniform motion or uniform speed or constant speed. The graph which is parallel to the time axis shows the object is at rest, and a curved graph represents non-uniform speed or non-uniform motion. Now students, recall the slope of a distance time graph indicates the speed of the object. If the distance time graph has a low slope, that is less steep, then the object has low speed. If the distance time graph has a higher slope, that is the graph is more steep, then the object has a higher speed. Now students, about the shape of graph, if a straight line represents the object has a uniform or a constant speed. Parallel to time axis graph, as we have seen, it is a stationary object, it represents a stationary object. And curved graph shows that object has a non-uniform speed or a non-uniform motion. So students, this is all about today's class. In next class we will study how we can draw the distance time graph representing a motion, and also we will discuss about the advantages of distance time graph. But for today's, best of luck. For next class, goodbye.